All right, so in the previous video, we went over Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator, which is one of the applications that runs on the Nexus Dashboard platform. In this video, we're going to cover Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller, which is another application that runs on the Nexus Dashboard platform. Now, in the previous video, we presented how Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator can manage multiple Cisco ACI fabrics at different sites in a multi-site architecture. And if you remember in that video, when we added those sites to Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator, we had to choose the site type, and we chose ACI. But there are other types of sites that you can choose. I believe the selections in that video showed another option was DCNM sites, and DCNM has been rebranded to Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller, which we're presenting in this video. So that is to say, what we're going to show here is that Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller it can act similar to an APIC in the sense that it can configure, let's say, VXLAN EVPN topology onto NXOS switches, and then provided that is the underlay, the VXLAN EVPN underlay is the template that you use with NDFC to deploy your fabric, then NDO can be pointed at NDFC to manage multi-site across those VXLAN EVPN fabrics running on NXOS as well. So in that case, when you're adding your sites to NDO, you would just choose the NDFC site, and I believe you would point at the URL for NDFC along with username and password, and you should be good to go. Very similar to what you would do when you point at your APICs. All right, so in this video, we're going to go over NDFC. So I'm going to go ahead and log into the platform here. And I'm using dcloud to run this demo. So there's some pre-built topologies and AS numbers and subnets and things like that you'll see me typing in during the video, but you don't have to worry about that. I clicked on begin setup, but we're not actually going to use the beginning setup. Here we are in the Nexus dashboard. If I look under services, interestingly, we see Fabric Controller, right? So just like in the previous video, we saw, actually what we saw under services was the service catalog, right? And then you can get into the App Store. There was also a fly out click on option for multi-site orchestrator or Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator. And here we have a tile for Fabric Controller. So when we click on that, it's going to launch us into the Fabric Controller application, and now we see that applications menu here. So I'll kind of do the same thing that I did on the last video. We don't have any fabrics currently showing up on our overview because we haven't added any yet, so we're going to do that as we go through here. We don't have any endpoint locator information, but we will be configuring the endpoint locator feature. We don't have any Vcenter VMs yet because we haven't pointed at Vcenter. We'll be doing that also. And we don't have any Kubernetes pods, and we're not going to be covering this in this video. Okay, once you have added one or more fabrics, then you can see those fabrics here under Topology, Data Center, and then you can wind up with one or multiple fabrics that you can click into. Operations kind of shows, the state of the network, is it healthy or not? And configuration will tell you whether the templates that you are sort of staging inside of NDFC have been pushed down and those configurations applied to the actual end devices in your fabric or not. So these are two very helpful views. You've also got an actions menu up here to do things like add fabrics and other things that you'll see in the video. Under LAN, you're probably going to spend most of your time here under fabrics, switches, and interfaces. Policies are really like a lot of the, Python scripts and everything that gets used to push the configurations down onto the fabric. So this is all basically built for you. I don't think there's anything that you need to do here. I guess you can create and edit your own policy, but if you're using the templates to configure your fabric, you're probably not going to have to do any of that. Interfaces would be all interfaces on all the switches in all your fabrics. So you can filter all those interfaces here. And there's a concept called interface groups, which I'm not yet familiar with, so I won't be covering that in this video. Let's see, under services, service nodes. So I believe this is where you're going to add in things like, load balancers and firewalls. Yeah, up here you've got firewall, load balancer, other virtual networking function. So you can add those into your fabric here, I suppose. I haven't read about this yet, so I'm also not too familiar with this piece. So mainly we're going to switch with fabrics and switches inside this video. So switches would obviously give you a list of switches in all of your different fabrics. You can see which fabric a particular switch is a part of here in the fabric name column. And then the fabrics are the different networks and different sites essentially that you're managing. Okay, under virtual management, you have your virtual infrastructure manager. So this is where we're going to point at our vCenter. And then settings, we have server settings that are, I guess I consider these, NDFC wide type settings. So, if we want NDFC to send alarms to an email address, we would set that here. Events, reports, there's a whole bunch of different functionality up here that you can read about in the user manual. Under feature management, this really has to do with when you first install Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller, there's 3 personalities that you can deploy that with. The first one is Fabric Discovery, which as it says here is discovery, inventory, and topology for your LAN, but you can't use it to provision any kind of configurations onto your Fabric devices. That's what Fabric Controller does, right? It does all of this plus provisioning of configurations, management of those configurations. And then SAN Controller does the same thing. It just does it for fiber channel storage networking configurations on the MDS and Nexus switching platforms. So when you select Fabric Controller, you've got a number of different functionalities that you can enable here. So we're not actually going to leverage this Kubernetes visualizer piece, but we are going to leverage Endpoint Locator, so you need to turn that on. Performance monitoring, that's pretty basic. We're going to want that for just about every network we run. VMM visualizer, so again, we're going to attach to our vCenter using this virtual infrastructure manager up here, so you want to enable that. And then Fabric Builder is essentially the piece that provisions your configurations onto your switches and helps you configure those requirements. So these are kind of a good standard set of features that are enabled. IP Fabric for media is meant for broadcast type networks. IPAM integration I haven't read about, but obviously that's for IP address management and so on. LAN credentials management. So when we do a discovery of a fabric, all the devices that we discover and the credentials that we use to connect to them are going to show up here. It's possible, I suppose, to edit those credentials if necessary, but you're probably not going to need to because before you do your discovery, you're going to want to make sure that all the devices that you're trying to add to your fabric are already set up with a management IP and the same username and password. So really, it should populate all that information for you. And then finally, under operations, again, these are things that I think help you operate your Fabric Controller application itself. So if you are looking for event analytics, you can find that here. Image management allows you to basically manage the images on the devices that you're managing in your fabric. So basically you've centralized the ability to, I believe here you can, stage an image, right? So first you go to images, you're going to have to upload an image. Once you've got the image, you should be able to stage an image to one or multiple devices, depending on what you're trying to accomplish and so on. So that's the basic idea here. License management. I believe NDFC leverages smart licensing, so you probably point at your smart account and basically add whatever licenses you've purchased for NDFC here. Tech support, if you need to do data collection on NDFC for TAC troubleshooting, you can do that here. Backup and restore your configurations. NX API certificates. So that I'm not 100% sure what that's used for. I don't know if that means NX API to talk to NDFC, or if this is if these certificates are leveraged to authenticate with and talk to NX API on endpoint devices that are managed by NDFC. So that'd be a good thing to look into. These templates, I believe, are the templates that we select when we're basically deploying Fabric, right? Creating a Fabric. So we should see that pretty soon. Yep, Easy Fabric, for example. We're going to use that in our demo here. Programmable reports. Haven't really read about this, but obviously you can create some kind of report, some kind of reporting function. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to come up here to Fabrics, and kind of like we added a site to Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator, we're sort of doing the same thing here. What we're creating is a logical container for all of the devices that we want to manage as a single fabric or a single site. So that's the idea. So we're just going to create this first one and call it brownfield, because we're going to point at a fabric that already exists, and we're going to import those configurations. And here we're going to choose this fabric template for VXLAN EVPN deployment with Nexus 9000 and 3000 switches. There are other templates available, including this multi-site domain fabric template, which we're going to use a bit later. Okay, so all you've done here is basically create the container, but you don't have any devices yet. So the devices that we're adding we're going to consider brownfield as site 2. So as such, we're going to use 65002 as the BGP AS number. Let's see if I scroll down. Yeah, there's a lot of defaults in here that have to do with your underlay for replication. That's multicast traffic. For VPCs, how do you want to manage your VPC domains? What are the range of IDs you're going to hand out, et cetera, et cetera. So these are just general settings that you're going to use to deploy your fabric. And obviously you can read about all of these settings in the documentation. But for the purposes of this demo, we're mostly going to keep the defaults. Under protocols, what kind of IDs do you want to use for your loopback interfaces? What is your default OSPF area ID, and so on and so forth. Now under advanced, if we come down to site ID, we can see we use the same ID as our BGP AS number. Let's see here. Greenfield cleanup option. We're not doing greenfield, we're doing brownfield, so we're going to leave this disabled. Under resources, since this is site 2, we're just going to change all these first octet IPs to be 20. And under configuration backup, we'll go ahead and set that to be hourly, and we'll go ahead and say save our fabric settings. Now we still don't have any devices inside our fabric. We just kind of have this container with a bunch of settings that specify, the parameters for this particular fabric. I was running a little bit slow this morning. There we go. So now we have our fabric. And we're going to go ahead and click into that fabric. So you can either single click and see some information about the fabric. Currently, again, we have no switches inside the fabric yet, and you can click this little flyout, or you can double click this link and it'll take you into the properties of that particular fabric. So here under switches, we see that we have no switches, and we're going to want to add switches. So the way we're going to do that is to provide a seed IP address on our management network to basically go out and search for our devices. Okay, so we've put in the management IP, username, and password to log in, and we're going to go up to 2 hops away from that particular device and see what we discover. And we've discovered 2 leaf switches, a spine switch, and a border gateway switch. So we're going to take all of these switches and we're going to add them to our fabric. can see an in progress indicator here. We can see the status of the switches before we add them is manageable, which means they are not currently managed by NDFC, either this instance or I think some other instance. This usually just takes a minute or two, so we'll give it a minute. Okay, and we see the status changing to switch added for all of our switches. That's great. So we're going to go ahead and click on close. And now under our Fabric Overview Switches tab, we can see all of our switches. Now, if we look at the role, they all look like leaf switches, but we can see that this one's supposed to be a spine, this one's supposed to be a border gateway. And if we close out the fabric real quick and we go back to our topology, we click into this brownfield fabric that we see here, we kind of see all these devices in sort of like this flat topology. And so what we really want to do is assign roles, appropriate roles, to these switches so that our topology looks correct. So for the spine, we're going to go ahead and set the role and tell it that we're going to be a spine. And for our border gateway switch, we're going to go ahead and do the same, but call it a border gateway. Okay, and it says perform recalculate configure the fabric to complete this change prior to deploy. So at the fabric level, which is up here at the top, you can go ahead and do a recalculate configuration. This usually takes a minute or two also. Okay, so we've recalculated our fabric config, and it looks like in order to achieve the goal that we have, which is changing the roles, well, we changed the roles on the spine and the border gateway, but we had already added the leaf switches. But just because we added the switches to the fabric doesn't mean that we've actually pushed our template configuration, the easy fabric template configurations, down onto the devices. So we've recalculated our configuration to include all of the configurations we need to push down, plus the role changes that we made for spine and border gateway. And now if we click here on pending configuration, we can actually see what is, what configurations are going to be sent down onto the devices. So, you can scroll through and look back here. And then obviously if the devices already had a configuration, then you could come to side-by-side comparison. So our starting configuration was super basic. So we can see how that compares on the left and on the right. Anything in green in terms of expected config is being added. Anything in red in terms of expected config would be being removed. Okay, so we can go ahead and deploy these configurations to the switches. It's usually fairly quick. There's only a couple of commands on the spine and border gateway, so those guys have succeeded. And there's more commands on the leaf switches, but both of those have succeeded now as well. So we can go ahead and close this out. And now we can see all the proper roles here. We can see config status is success. We can see operational status is healthy. Obviously, we've discovered the switches because we've now added them to our fabric. And we can see what version of software they're running and their uptime, everything in one central view. Now, if we close out the fabric again, we go back to topology and click into brownfield, then you'll notice that now the topology isn't flat, right? Because we've defined a spine and a spine role and a border gateway and a border gateway role. It allows us to sort of easily adjust the visual effect of our devices, right, and our topology. So now we're going to go back and we're going to add a second fabric, and this one is going to be called greenfield. We're also going to use easy fabric. This one's going to be 65001, and then under site ID 65001, under resources we're going to leave everything starting with 1 because it's site 1. Under config and backup we'll do an hourly backup, and I think that will cover it. Now, something I should have done in the brown field is to preserve the configurations when I was doing the discovery. So I'll show you that here when we go to add our switches to our new fabric. That was a mistake I made here in the demo. So right here, preserve configuration. So it looks like the default is to preserve the config, which is what I wanted to do on the brownfield fabric, so that's a good thing. Since this is a greenfield fabric, I don't want to preserve any configurations on the switches that may exist because I'm attempting to deploy configurations for a brand new fabric. So essentially what this will do is it'll make sure that the only config that's left on the switches is the management IP, and then it'll provision all the new switches. All the new configurations. So we're going to go ahead and, all switch configuration other than management will be removed immediately after import. Do you want to proceed? We'll go ahead and confirm. So we're just doing our discovery here, right? We're scanning our subnet. We found spine and a leaf. I was expecting to find a border gateway here. Make sure I typed in the right IP. 198.18.4.101. Yeah, there should be a border gateway here. So that might mess up some other steps in my demo, but let's just see what we're able to accomplish. Or let's try the discovery one more time. Probably not going to be any different. Maybe there's a VM down or something in the lab. All right, so we're going to go ahead and add these switches to our fabric and see what happens. And just like in the previous fabric, we're going to want to set roles on our switches after we've got them added to our fabric. Okay, so we'll close this out. We'll define the spine as a spine role. We'll recalculate our config. And then we'll go ahead and deploy it. Switches are reloading. Please ensure switches are reachable and then perform recalculate config. Well, that's interesting. I didn't tell the switches to reload. All I did was discover them. So let's see if we can. I wonder if the last IP, the gateway IP. See, this was 4.101, or the border gateway switch. I wonder if that guy was reloading for some reason. Already managed. One 108.18.4.101. Yeah, I should have found a border gateway. Anyway, okay, let's try and recalculate config. Switches are reloading. So I wonder if that's because I did not preserve configurations on the devices, if it reloaded them. The last time I did this demo, this didn't happen, so I'm just going to have to kind of play this one by ear and see how it goes. All right, so I'm going to close out this fabric for now, and we're going to go ahead and add a core switch. The core is essentially going to act as a inter-site network between the two fabrics, between the brownfield and the greenfield fabrics. So we're going to create a fabric. We're going to call it core, choose a template, and we're going to use this external fabric template for support of Nexus and non-Nexus devices, but we're not running VXLAN EVPN. This is just an IP transport network. Okay, so we're going to define 65003. We're going to disable, let's see, fabric monitor mode, and under advanced. Oh, I know why the switch is rebooted. I'll explain that in just a minute. Let's see here. I don't think there's anything I need to do in here. All these defaults should be fine. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. And then we're going to click. Okay, so let me first, before we add a device to our core, if I go into greenfield, what do you think here? Edit fabric. Then I get all my fabric settings, and under advanced, when I was adding the brownfield fabric, I showed there was a setting down here for greenfield cleanup option. It says switch cleanup without reload when preserve config equals no. So we didn't want to preserve the configs for the greenfield fabric. We disabled that checkbox, but I didn't come in here and say enable greenfield cleanup option, which cleans up the switches without a reload. So that's why the switches are reloading, is because I accidentally left this set to disable. Okay, so going out of this fabric, going back to core, we're going to add our devices, add switches, put in our seed IP, which now is 198.18.4.205. We'll go ahead and discover our switches. Okay, and we have this DCI router right here, which is manageable. So we're going to go ahead and add that. Now, one thing you need to think, right, is greenfield fabric and brownfield fabric are both already cabled to this DCI router. So whatever your physical cabling needs to be in order to meet your topology for your design, that all needs to be done before you basically do any kind of, device discovery or provisioning. Okay, so we added that switch. We'll go ahead and change his role to be a core router. And we'll recalculate the config. And then we'll go ahead and push that config. which has succeeded. So now we're hopefully that fabric is done, and we're going to go back to our greenfield fabric because we had some switches that were reloading. So that I can't imagine why I don't have the border gateway. Let me try this just one last time and see if maybe there's another device that is reloading. Switch not reachable. Already managed. So we got our spine and our leaf, and I'm wondering if this here is the border gateway that I was looking for, but may have to come back to that some time later. All right, so we still need to do a recalculate of config on this fabric, and then push our configurations down, right? Because this is a greenfield fabric. We haven't done that yet. Okay, so pending configurations, we're going to push those down. Okay, so our configurations have been pushed onto our switches. That looks good. Config status here should success, and it does. All right, so I think we're looking pretty good here. If we go to our topology now, we see three different fabrics, right? We have our brown field, we have our core, we have our green field. And like I said, the core is like an inter-site network, an IP-based transport network that basically connects brown field to green field. That's our topology. So that's good. And you can double click on any of these icons to go into the respective fabrics. So from an operational perspective, right, our fabrics are healthy. From a configuration perspective, we can see that all of the configs are in sync, meaning the configs that are in Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller have been successfully pushed down to the devices. If they weren't, or if they were pending, these icons would change to these different colors to indicate their status. Okay, so last fabric that we need to do, since I mentioned, right, that that essentially you can have a multi-site domain where Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator is capable of, achieving multi-site functionality across these different VXLAN EVPN fabrics. So there's there's a construct in NDFC called multi-site domain. So we're going to put in MSD, and then we're going to choose this multi-site domain fabric. And it says fabric template for VXLAN EVPN multi-site domain that can contain other VXLAN EVPN fabrics with layer 2 and layer 3 overlay extensions. So just like ACI. Let's see what we need to do here. Under DCI, we want to do centralized to route server. This is going to be 100, 100, 100, 100. This is going to be 65003. We're going to check this box off, and I think that's all we need to do. Okay, and we'll click Save. Now, this multi-site domain fabric is just a container, and we need to add other fabrics to it. So instead of switches up here, I mean, you can add switches, but you also see child fabrics, and we've already defined 3 different fabrics, right? So we want to move the brownfield fabric into our multi-site domain. We want to move the greenfield fabric into our multi-site domain. And we want to add the core fabric, which is our inter-site network, into our multi-site domain. Okay, so if we go ahead and click X, we can now see that these guys are essentially nested underneath this multi-site domain. If we go back to topology now, we don't have any changes here yet. One other thing is for greenfield, I told you that I thought we were missing a switch, so just because it's been several minutes, I want to try one last time, see if we can find that border gateway. 401. Nope, no border gateway today. All right, that's fine. So that's probably gonna mess us up, but it is what it is. So I think maybe that's why I'm not seeing any topology change here at this time. Maybe if I double click on multi-site domain, yeah, this is what I was expecting to see. But this fabric over here for greenfield doesn't have its border gateway. There should be a border gateway here, and that border gateway should be connected to the core. So this is actually going to mess up, I think, our demo, but it is what it is. I don't know why there's a problem with the lab environment this morning. It's not something I manage. I just schedule it and use it. All right, so the idea now, right, is we can see that we have, you know, a fabric over here on the left, greenfield, a fabric over here on the right, brownfield. They have different number of devices, slightly different topologies, similar concepts. Both of those should be connected to our core or our inter-site network to achieve multi-site across our VXLAN EVPN fabrics, and and then you can create networks and VRFs and attach those to the different devices, typically your leaf switches, etc., based on what it is you're trying to achieve. Now, if we wanted to add in Vcenter, we would go to Virtual Management, Virtual Infrastructure Manager, and we can say add an instance. In this case, we're going to use Vcenter. So the IP for this guy is 3.30. Okay, and what this does is it goes out to Vcenter and it tries to understand, it basically pulls down all the metadata from Vcenter. So it understands all the VMs that have been deployed, which hosts those VMs are running on, what the network connectivity is for each of those hosts in terms of its internal vSwitching and connectivity to the fabric that you have connected it to, connected those hosts to. So this is a great sort of troubleshooting tool for understanding what your virtual machine connectivity looks like. Looks like the status here is okay. Let's go back to Topology, and now this is our vCenter instance that we just added, and it's managing VMs in brown field, it's managing VMs in green field. So I think if we double click on vCenter and we double click on VMs, we can see that we have these 3 physical servers. And if I just click on one, then server 1 is connected to vSwitch 1, which is on this particular host, which is connected to these upstream leaf switches. So like I was saying, right, it shows you where your what your VM connectivity, virtual switching connectivity looks like through the ESX hosts and onto the actual fabric. If you want to navigate within your topology back to like the root to look at your overall data center, you can do that. Go to Greenfield Leaf. Yeah, okay. So I guess in order to see my VMs, I have to go through vCenter to be able to do that. Let's click on compute. This is the one server. So yeah, we can see we have, this is the one server, the compute, and then here's the different virtual machines. They're all connected through different vSwitches through the same host. So anyway, you get the basic idea. Okay, so for endpoint learning, I go to dashboard, endpoint locator, actions. Try to remember where I have to configure this. Over to brown field. Configure endpoint locator. Okay, so before I do that, let's go back and define week 2. Week 2. We'll go ahead and can we edit the switch? No, but we know it's part of the brownfield fabric. Edit fabric. Well, I don't want to edit the fabric. I want the fabric properties. So we said this was brownfield, so we'll go to brownfield, switches, leaf 2, and then we go to interfaces. And we want to change this interface here to be a routed interface for EPL, endpoint learning, routed interface. And our interface IP is going to be 18.4.1. Net mask should be 24. Down here at the bottom, so we'll get out of this. Now we're back in the leaf. We're back in the fabric. So now under the fabric, we want to configure endpoint locator. Configure my fabric. We're going to choose spine 2, and we'll leave the rest of these settings as default. Save our config. So I believe what we're doing here is we're establishing a routed connection from leaf 2 Ethernet 1.3 to spine 2. And because the spines run In ACI, the spines run COOP protocol, which means that the spines have all of the endpoint information, all the endpoint database information for the entire fabric. They know where every single MAC address in the entire fabric lives. And that would be the point of using endpoint learning, right, is to be able to troubleshoot, quickly identify where certain hosts are in the network. Have they moved? If they're virtual machines, have they moved from one host to another? Does that change their virtual switching and physical switching topology, etc.? So very useful for troubleshooting. Now, come on now. Endpoint Locator usually takes a couple of minutes to configure successfully. So if we go to Dashboard, Endpoint Locator, it'll take a few minutes for any endpoints to show up here. I've seen that when I ran this lab before. So one thing I'm going to do is go into MPuTTY, and I'm going to open up, let me think here, server 2 and server 3. And if I look at server 2 is 10.10.10.11 and server 3 should be 10.10.11.11, which it is. And theoretically, we should be able to ping 10.10.11.11, but I'm not sure if this is actually going to work. Yeah, it is working. I was saying that because we're missing our border gateway, so how this is working, I'm not 100% sure. Now, the last thing I want to do is, if I log into this, I log into Spine 2. It'll let me in. HTTP, hope to VPN, to VPN, VPN. Ten dot 10.10.11, so it does have routes. Let's do summary. So this right here is the neighbor relationship or the IP on the fabric on Spine 2 that has a neighbor relationship to the IP that we configured on the routed interface on Leaf 2. So if we do a ping 198.18.4.1 for management, then we get a successful ping. Okay, so that's how we're picking up the endpoint information. So we should be able to come back here on Nexus dashboard, and now we have this list of active endpoints. So we can see that 10.10.10.11, which is server 2, is connected to Leaf 2, and 10.10.11.11, which is server 3, is actually connected to Leaf 3. And then if you click on each one of these, right, you get kind of a endpoint life. You get kind of a history of, I suppose, where that endpoint lived at various points in time. Active switch, inactive switch. So you would get to you would be able to tell where this endpoint, which switch it was connected to at what point in time, based on where it's orange, right? Based on where it's active. So anyway, I know this wasn't a perfect demo, but the idea, I think the main concepts that we want to convey in this video are that of the multiple personalities that Fabric Controller can be deployed with, that if you want to provision configurations onto either greenfield fabrics or even import brownfield fabrics and retain those configurations, but then manage them and modify them on an ongoing basis, you can do both of those things, but you need to deploy Fabric Controller using the Fabric Controller personality and not the Fabric Discovery personality. Fabric Discovery is part of the functionality of Fabric Controller. Okay, so creating a fabric is just creating a container that you're going to populate with a number of switches that you discover and then manage. And then, each of those switches you want to assign roles so that your topology looks accurate. And when you're defining your fabric, all of the fabric settings are, they're really defining like your underlay for VXLAN, EVPN, what protocols you're going to use, what OSPF area IDs you're going to use, what pool of IPs you're going to use to assign loopbacks. All of your point-to-point network connectivity between switches is all configured for you by the system, and you don't have to do any kind of IP planning or any of that. So it allows you to get a fabric definition along with importing of the switches that you wish to manage into that fabric and configurations pushed down to those devices very quickly, right? And then you can point at NDFC from Nexus Dashboard Orchestrator. So anyway, that's all I've got for this demo. Sorry for the problems. Hopefully you've got a decent idea of what NDFC is, how it works, and thanks for watching.